must stop the terror. Now watch this drive.
How do you like my garbage truck? This truck is in honor of Kamala and Joe Biden.
Wakanda forever.
Minnesota!
Please clap.
I know the human being and fish can coexist peacefully.
Rick, I'll tell you what. 10,000 bucks? $10,000 bet?
I'm not in the betting business,
but okay.
Spencer Cox is a former telecom executive who always seems like he's auditioning for the title of America's guiltiest white guy.
I'm a Republican. I'm a Democrat. Go Jazz.
Rip City, go Blazers.
Disagreeing better, not disagreeing less, is the answer.
Fellow patriots, welcome to the Pattern Recognition Podcast. It's Wednesday, December 3rd. We're live, and we're ready for a great show tonight. So we're going to be discussing Trump's recent executive orders targeting third world immigration, the Somali fraud and crime waves, and yesterday's special congressional election in Tennessee and what that means for the 2026 midterms. Let's get started with last night's election results in Tennessee, because it actually is a big deal and it is kind of a forecast for what to expect in 2026. Yesterday's voters in Tennessee's 7th congressional district elected Republican Matt Van Epps in a hotly contested special election. Incumbent Republican Congressman Mark Green, he actually retired from Congress in July, leaving this seat open. Despite being a traditionally red Republican seat, a safe red Republican seat, the results were closer than many people were expecting. Van Epps defeated Democrat Afton Ben by 8.9 points, securing 53.9% to Baines' Baines' 45%. Republicans badly needed to win this seat to protect their slim 6-seat majority in the House, especially with Marjorie Taylor Greene set to retire in January. So on the surface, a victory is a victory, but you kind of have to look at it within the context. First, just a quick explainer. When seats become open in Congress, each chamber has different rules for how those vacancies can be filled. So when a seat opens up in the Senate, the governor of those states appoints a replacement to temporarily fill that seat, and then they schedule special elections for somebody to serve the remainder of that term. So, for example, like if Mitt Romney, well, that's a bad example, he's not in the Senate anymore. If John Curtis retired, then Cox would appoint somebody to fill Curtis's seat, and then he would call a special election for somebody to serve out the rest of Curtis's term. In the House, though, there are no appointments. If a seat opens up in the House, the governor must schedule a special election, so that seat remains vacant until somebody is elected to serve the remainder of that term. So in this case, the seat was held by Mark Green. He retired in July. Apparently he's taking a job in the private sector. I think if you're elected to serve, especially in the House of Representatives, it's only 2 years. The terms are very short. If you're elected to serve 2 years, just serve your 2 years. And if you want to retire and go work in the private sector and make more money, serve out the rest of your term. It's not a Senate seat. I don't know what possibly could be, more lucrative than, there is a lot of things that are probably more lucrative, but regardless, this seat was held by Mark Green. He was a Republican. He was elected 4 times to represent this district in Tennessee. It carves out part of Nashville. It's in the center of Tennessee. In Green's 2 most recent elections, 2022 and 2024, which is what the current map uses, he defeated his Democrat opponent by 22 points, winning each of them by more than 59%. Trump also won that district by 22 points in 2024. So needless to say, this is traditionally a very red district. So the fact that the Republican only won by less than 9 points has obviously caused some heartburn among Republican leaders as we head into 2026. So obviously, it's important to remember that these special congressional elections tend to break historic trends for a number of reasons. Obviously, in normal midterm and presidential election years, the parties have to strategize how they allocate their money because you have 435 seats. Some seats are really safe, some seats are really competitive. So they have to strategize like, okay, we have, let's just say $50 million. We're going to, we'll disperse some money to our incumbents, make sure that they win their races, but more or less they're going to be safe in these certain districts. But in these competitive races, that's where we're going to spend, $5-10 million. We have to be strategic with this. But all bets are off in special elections because vacancies are really rare. You'll only have a special election. You might have 2 or 3 in a given term. So this allows both parties to focus all of their energy on districts they wouldn't normally be competitive in. So, for example, in this case, in 2024, Green's campaign, Mark Green, the guy who retired, the Republican, his campaign spent $2.1 million while the Democrats spent $1.1 million, and outside PAC spending accounted for total less than $700,000 for both sides. So it was like a $4 million race in 2024, this Tennessee 7th District. In this special election, Van Epps' campaign is projected to have spent about $3.1 million, and Boehner's campaign is projected to spend about $1.5 million. But both parties had major PAC donors and national support. Trump's, I think it's MAGA Inc., Trump's PAC was heavily supporting the Republican. There was Democrat PAC support for the Democrat candidate. Republican PAC spent $4.5 million on this race, and Democrats spent $2.5 million. So this makes this race nearly a $12 million race for a seat that's, in 2022 and 2024, a 20 plus, Republican district. So this race also drew national attention, obviously, for that reason, and support from national figures on both sides that isn't normally seen in a district like this. Kamala Harris actually went to Tennessee on the ground and did campaigning for Boehner. She did like a rally. AOC hosted a virtual rally with Al Gore. Al Gore, obviously the VP for Bill Clinton, but he was a Tennessee senator before he was the vice president. Trump actually hosted 2 of his own virtual rallies for Van Epps, and Mike Johnson, the speaker, actually went in person to Tennessee for a final campaign push on Monday. So both parties were heavily involved. They were heavily looking at this. It's a slim majority that the Republicans hold. So if the Democrats were able to flip it, then obviously that would be a huge win for them. And the fact that Marjorie Taylor Greene is set to retire in January, I think like January 5th, that means that, the Republicans could not afford to lose this race. Political momentum in U.S. politics can change so fast. I mean, do you remember how when people were writing off the Democrats and they're saying that they were a dead party after 2024? They didn't. It was 53-45. Like that's not a close race necessarily, but it's closer than it has been historically. So, that kind of begs the question, did voters switch parties? Or did the Republicans struggle to turn out voters to rally their base, while Democrats, on the other hand, they remain fired up after sweeping victories in Virginia, in New Jersey, and New York, like just a few weeks ago, a month ago? Are they still fired up? Just for comparison, in 2024, it was a presidential year, and it was, one of the most hotly contested, elections in American history. So turnout was massive, and they're always massive in presidential years, and they're pretty big in normal midterm elections like what we've got coming up. But in 2024, the Republican candidate, he got 192,000 votes, and the Democrat got 122,000. This time around, the Republican candidate, Van Epps, who won, he got 97,000, and the Democrat got 81,000. So the Republican turnout fell 50%, while the Democrat turnout only fell 33%. So I'm not sure this is probably a case of, people who voted for Trump and Green, switching to the GOP. Maybe exit polls will show that. I just think more than likely the Democrats were really fired up, and they did a really good job of turning their base out. And Republicans are, frankly, they especially in a safe seat like that, they don't feel like they need to vote. Maybe some people who are, independents or, just strictly Trump voters, or, they're mad. They're mad they're not getting what they voted for. So I think Trump and the Republicans are going to have to shift pretty hard and make some major policy and rhetoric adjustments if they want to reverse these voting trends. Especially as we head into 2026, they're going to have to figure out what they can do if they want to keep the House and the Senate. They're going to have to find a way to convince their base and convince their voters that you got to come out, you got to turn out. We have to keep the House if you want to see, any of these things that we promised you. But at the same time, they got to deliver for us. So that kind of leads us to our next topic, though: Somali fraud. And Trump's third world executive orders. So I promised that I would touch on this topic last space, and so I've done some prep today. And the more research I've done into this topic, the more angry it makes me, frankly, but also the more just blown away I am at the arrogance on the Democrat side, the arrogance on the Somali side, the just blatant corruption and fraud that exists. I mean, I'll go through a lot of these points, and it's hard to wrap your head around just how corrupt, and it doesn't make any sense. So there's a story published by the New York Times on November 29th, just a few days after Trump's infamous, Thanksgiving rant tweet where he called Tim Walz retarded and he accused Ilhan Omar of marrying her brother. Before I break down this story and the details of these instances, I just want to point out, though, how insane it is that this was all of this, like these details that were highlighted in this story, how insane it is that this was pretty much all completely swept under the rug by the mainstream media for the entirety of the Harris-Walz campaign. If you have been somewhat paying attention to politics, or if you're somewhat keyed in and you're aware of, how crazy 2020 was for the state of Minnesota. I mean, George Floyd, that happened in Minneapolis, the Summer of Love, that was all, centered around Minneapolis. You had Tim Walz's wife, talking about how she would open the windows of the governor's mansion to let in the smoke of the burning fires because it smelled like revolution. That's Tim Walz's wife. Almost became the second lady of the United States. So it wasn't that, none of that was news necessarily to people who were, keyed in at all and paying attention to what was going on in our country in 2020. But the fact that the mainstream media did not care to highlight any of that or any of this Somali fraud until after, he loses the election and things just become so bad at like how they've gone now in Minneapolis, just goes to show, grateful for the New York Times for publishing this piece, but they're about 5 years too late. They're at the very least they're a year late, but they're 5 years too late. But the New York Times piece, it's titled "How Fraud Swamped Minnesota's Social Services System on Tim Walz's Watch," and it highlights how over the past 5 years, fraud, quote, I'm quoting the article, fraud, quote, took root in pockets of Minnesota's Somali diaspora. Scores of individuals set up nonprofits and companies that build state agencies for millions of dollars in social service benefits that were never actually provided. Things like child nutrition, housing support, other safety net services. There was these just fake companies that were set up that would bill to, the state agent, the state, and then they would not provide any of the things that they were contracted to provide. 59 people have been arrested so far, and you guessed it, almost all of them are Somali. Three major schemes are highlighted Three major schemes are highlighted in the article, including the main one that they focus on is this organization called Feeding Our Future. It's a child nutrition organization. Federal prosecutors say 59 people have been convicted so far, and more than $1 billion in taxpayer money has been stolen. And that's just from these three kind of main schemes that they focus on in the article. So it's probably way more than that. And that 1 billion figure, that's actually more than what Minnesota spends annually on its Department of Corrections, which we're going to circle back to that. But just keep that in mind. There was $1 billion stolen from taxpayers in Minnesota, and that $1 billion, that's, who knows what that could have been used for, but that's more than what Minnesota spends on its Department of Corrections. There's some key points and notes from the article. Federal prosecutors began charging defendants in connection to those schemes in actually 2022 under the Biden administration, starting with the Feeding Our Future organization, which it partnered with dozens of quote unquote local businesses that served as feeding sites during the pandemic. I'm going to quote the article. I'm going to quote a couple of quotes from the article real quick. So here's a quote real quick. State agencies reimbursed the group and its partners for invoices claiming to have fed tens of thousands of children. In reality, federal prosecutors said, most of the meals were non-existent, and business owners spent the funds on luxury cars, houses, and even real estate projects abroad. Real estate projects abroad. I wonder which, country abroad that could possibly be. Here's another quote. The program's annual cost ballooned to more than $104 million last year, authorities said, from a budgeted projection of $2.6 million when it began in 2020. So from $2.6 million in 2020 to more than $100 million last year. And then here's another quote. In another program aimed to provide therapy for autistic children, prosecutors said providers recruited children from Minneapolis's Somali community, falsely certifying them as qualifying for autism treatment and paying their parents kickbacks for cooperation. So again, blatant fraud, blatant abuse of the system, just taking advantage of the taxpayers in Minnesota, the American taxpayer, pulling at our heartstrings. They're all, under the guise of helping these autistic refugees, whatever they want to call themselves. So government officials, they began to notice these red flags surrounding the pandemic fraud. Actually, government officials began noticing it in 2020, right when the pandemic started and when these, programs started, but they were bullied into submission. I'm going to quote again. In 2020, Minnesota Department of Education officials who administered the program became overwhelmed by the number of applicants seeking to register new feeding sites and began raising questions about the plausibility of some invoices. Feeding Our Future, the nonprofit group that was the largest provider in the pandemic program, responded with a warning. In an email, the group told the state agency that failing to promptly approve new applicants from minority-owned businesses would result in a lawsuit featuring accusations of racism that would be sprawled across the news. Feeding Our Future later sued the agency, which continued reimbursing claims and approving new sites in the months that followed. The quotes continue. Casey Megan, a Somali American who formerly worked as a fraud investigator for the Minnesota Attorney General's office, said elected officials in the state were reluctant to take more assertive action in response to allegations in the Somali community. There's a perception that forcefully tackling this issue might cause political backlash among the Somali community, which is a core voting bloc for Democrats, said Mr. Megan, who is among of the few figures in the Somali community to speak out against the fraud. So the quote ends. So essentially, Minnesota officials were raising the alarm that none of these invoices made sense from these contractors that the state was awarding. And when they tried to, raise the flag, when they tried to bring this up to the ladder to Tim Walz, which we'll talk about this later, when they tried to address this, they were threatened by the Somali community. They were threatened by Tim Walz. They were told that if they pushed this, that they would be accused of racism and they would be sued. And, this was right after George Floyd. So, this was at the height of the summer of love, the height of this, crazed, gay race communism that was going on in all of our major cities. So, it makes total sense that they would be, pretty much scared into silence. But in recent days, Somali and Minnesota officials have been forced to acknowledge the rampant fraud and the crimes committed by Somalis in Minnesota. And they admit that they basically admit that they've been unable to assimilate into American society. Ahmed, I can't get his name, Ahmed Samatar, he's a Somali professor of Somali studies at Macalester College in St. Paul. He argues that Somali refugees who came to the United States after their country's civil war in the 90s, they were raised in a culture where stealing from the country's dysfunctional and corrupt government was widespread. So, they came from a country that was a failed state. The country's dysfunctional. The government's corrupt. They're used to stealing from the government. So why do we expect, if we bring them here, that they're not going to try to steal from our government? He basically is making the argument that so many of us make, that these third worlders can't come to America and assimilate properly, and we get called racist for that. And then he can just say it openly, and it's considered, this enlightened opinion because he's a professor of Somali studies. He says, I'm quoting him, American society and the denizens of the state of Minnesota have been extremely good to Somalis. Minnesota proved susceptible to rampant fraud because it is so tolerant, so open, and so geared towards keeping an eye on the weak. So again, saying the quiet part out loud, it's not really the quiet part, but just saying out loud what so many of us have been saying, that these third worlders, they're brought here by these NGOs, by the State Department, by the UN. I'm going to get into that a little bit. They're brought here, and the people don't want to be, Americans are good people. American Christians are good people. And we want, for the most part, I don't think this is unfair to say at all, we want to help people from, war-torn, battered countries. I think that's not a crazy thing to say. Part of what's happened is the American psyche, the American, charitable Christian psyche has been hijacked by these bad faith actors who want to destroy our country, who want to dilute our culture and our society and replace, Americans. And they know that so many of them will, even if they feel somewhat uncomfortable a little bit, they might tolerate it because, they're good Christians. They say it out loud. Minnesota proved susceptible to rampant fraud because it is so tolerant, so open, and so geared toward keeping an eye on the weak. So that happens in Minnesota. If you've been listening to me, you know that this is definitely a critique I have of many Utahns and the Mormon culture here in Utah. So a Twitter account named Minnesota Staff Fraud Reporting Commentary, which claims to represent more than 480 staff members of the Minnesota Department of Human Services, they had a post go viral this week where they claimed members of the Minnesota DHS warned Tim Walz of this fraud, but they were retaliated against. They accused Tim Walz of being 100% responsible for massive fraud in Minnesota. I'm quoting them. 100% responsible for massive fraud in Minnesota, and say that he has failed Minnesota. They say they warned Walz and the Department of Human Services leadership about the fraud early on. So, between 2020 and 2022, they warned them. But instead of partnering with them to stop it, Walz and the leadership retaliated against the whistleblowers, allegedly using monitoring, threatening them, and discrediting their reports. Or they tried to discredit their whistleblower reports. They also said they warned the Harris campaign about Walz's refusal to address this fraud, but they were ignored. And they claim that, quote, leadership did not want to appear to discriminate against certain communities, and therefore they were unwilling to take enforcement steps that might look like they were targeting those communities. So, again, because the Somali professor, he made this point again. The Somali community in Minnesota is a massive voting bloc for the Democrats. So if the Democrats, Tim Walz, the DHS leadership, the AG of Minnesota is Keith Keith Ellison, he's a Democrat. If they go after these fraud abuses, the Somali community, they were afraid the Somali community was going to be pissed at them and, they'd lose support. There's allegations that are coming out that Keith Ellison actually solicited campaign donations from these Somalians that were getting, these fraud payments, that they were getting these payments, these contracts from the government, and they weren't fulfilling their contractual obligations. They weren't fulfilling their services. And he essentially is alleged to have told them that he would look the other way if they donated to his campaign and to the Democrats. So that's Minnesota is completely captured. Big picture, federal prosecutors and other investigators are essentially saying that Minnesota has experienced one of the largest waves of welfare and social services fraud in U.S. history. There's also been allegations as part of these ongoing investigations that some of the stolen welfare funds have actually been rerouted back to Somalia, to a terrorist organization, Al-Shabaab. Again, not surprising that the investigations claim that the money made its way to foreign real estate projects. It's not surprising that this fraud would make its way back to Somalian terrorist organizations. So that kind of just, during this, I'm reading this article. It's shocking, but it's not surprising, frankly. If you've been paying attention to what's been going on in Minnesota, since 2020 at least, it's shocking, but it's not surprising. But it kind of begs the question, how the hell did these Somalians get here in the first place? It's not like Somalia is in the Americas, where you've got, Mexico, or you got Central Americans, Colombians, Venezuelans, El Salvadorians, Guatemalans coming up through, the Darien Gap, and then coming up through Mexico, and then being helped by the human traffickers in Mexico all the way up, and then crossing our border, and the Biden administration taking down the border and the border wall and cutting the wires in Texas and essentially inviting them in. That's its own separate issue. It's not like it's H-1B, recipients from India or Pakistan that are coming over and overstaying their visas, or coming in from Canada. It's none of that. Somalia is it's on the eastern side of Africa. If they're coming here, they are, their boats are just pirate boats. They're not taking their little pirate dinghies all the way across the Atlantic. How are they coming to the United States? Well, so I started doing a little bit of digging into that. Somalia has been in civil war since the 90s. When that civil war broke out, just like anywhere, when there's a civil war that breaks out and famine breaks out as a result of government and infrastructure collapse, there's a massive refugee crisis. So the way that Somalians make their way to the United States, obviously they make their way into Europe because it's just a massive, Afro-Eurasian continent. It's really easy to move around that continent, unfortunately. And that's part of the blessing of the American continent, is that we're separated by two oceans. But when you have, and I'll explain, when you have the UN and the US State Department, actively funding people's flights, that's how they get here. So they flee Somalia to a neighboring country, usually Kenya or Ethiopia. They register with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, so the UNHCR. It's a refugee agency. The UNHCR refers certain refugees that they qualify. They refer them either to Europe or they refer them to the U.S. When they're referred to the U.S., that's the State Department. The State Department assigns refugees to a city where a U.S. nonprofit resettling agency operates. And the State Department program is called the Reception and Placement Program. And I have this PDF pulled up. I'm going to share this I actually should just make an article about this and put it on my website because it's so fucking crazy. But the resettlement agency, they work with 9 nonprofits. 6 of them are faith-based. So each approved refugee is sponsored by one of the 9 resettlement organizations, and it's the Church World Service, it's the Ethiopian Community Development Council, the Episcopal Migration Ministries, the HIAS, the International Rescue Committee, which is very active in Utah, the Lutheran Immigrant and Refugee Service, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, and the World Relief Program. So those partner agencies are basically a refugee is assigned to them, and they operate in all these cities. And for every refugee that is assigned to them, they are given about $2,400 from the State Department for covering their flights, for covering the first 30 to 90 days. I actually read, the State Department gives these organizations one-time per refugee payments to cover the first 30 to 90 days of arrival. So airport pickup, initial rent, furnishings, food, basic household items, caseworker time, things like that. So $2,400. It's half of it is approved to cover admin and staff costs. So, and they're expected to also raise private funds. So a lot of these organizations get money from their churches, from donors, but they also get, again, they get $2,400 per refugee from the State Department, and they can use about $1,200 of that to pay staff. So if you just want to look at it, for every refugee that they approve to bring over, these organizations, these church faith-based organizations, get essentially $1,200 to pay staff. So that's essentially how the business behind these refugee resettlements. And if you are granted refugee status in the United States, you immediately qualify for a Social Security number, for work authorization, for Medicaid, and for SNAP benefits. So, I mean, again, like, none of this is necessarily surprising. It's shocking. It's no wonder that we have rampant inflation. I mean, we printed obviously like a third or like a fourth of all dollars in the past like 5 years, but we're also hosting, 50 to 100 million foreigners in our country, and most of them all qualify for SNAP. Most of them all qualify for Medicaid. And these Somali refugees specifically, they began arriving in the U.S. around the 90s. There's now, by this point, so it's been 35 years since the Somalis began arriving. When you come, like, if you yourself are granted refugee status, that kind of fast tracks you to get citizenship. Once you have citizenship and you have legal residence, you can actually sponsor your mother, your father, your cousin, your third cousin. You can sponsor more people to come over from Somalia. So by this point in 2025, there's an estimated 250 to 300,000 Somalians living in the United States. That's a conservative estimate. There's an estimated 100,000 Somalis living in Minnesota alone. About a third of them all live in Minnesota. And anywhere from 65 to 80,000 of those live in the St. Paul, Minneapolis metro area. The St. Paul, Minneapolis metro area, that's the hub of the Somali diaspora in the United States. For reference, in Utah, I did this research. There's about 10,000 Somali families living in Utah. So I think that's a different topic for another space that I want to do, because that's a whole other issue. I mean, we have Somali highway patrolmen. We have Somali police officers in Sandy that they're bragging about. It's pretty eye-opening. But I mean, November 2025, that election that happened a few weeks ago, the one where Democrats, destroyed the Republicans in New Jersey. They destroyed the Republicans in Virginia. They had their mayoral race in Minneapolis. They nearly elected a Somali mayor. If you remember that. And they actually, the Somalian actually won the Democrat primary, and then it was voided because Democrats and liberal Republicans love to meddle in their primaries. Wink, wink, Spencer Cox. But the Somali mayor, I'm pretty sure it went to a ranked choice runoff. So that just goes to show how prevalent the Somali population is, and again, how prevalent and how strong of a voting block the Somali population is in Minneapolis. I mean, they have a Somalian representing them in Congress, Ilhan Omar. She's Somalian. She represents Minneapolis. The incumbent mayor, he barely won re-election, and he had to pander to Somali voters. He cut ads and did rallies in Somali. Like, he learned Somali to be able to speak with those voters. I mean, if that's not conquered territory, I don't know what is. I mean, going back to the New York Times article, there's a pretty eye-opening quote that I think really just serves as the embodiment of how badly things have gotten in Minnesota. This quote's from Joseph Thompson. He's the federal prosecutor overseeing these cases. He was quoted in the article. He said he believes that race sensitivities played a major role in the rise of fraud. As pandemic assistance was dispersed, the state was also reeling from the killing of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer in May 2020. This was a huge part of the problem, Mr. Thompson said during an interview in the summer. Allegations of racism can be a reputation or career killer. So nobody wanted to say anything. Nobody wanted to stop it. Everybody just wanted to keep bringing him in because that's where the financial incentives laid. They get $1,200 essentially per head that they bring in, and then every bureaucrat, every elected official was too scared to say anything about it, and so they've just let this problem run rampant. Where now you have one of the largest fraud cases in American history, where you have taxpayer funds going to real estate projects in Somalia. I mean, this quote, it partially helps explain the brain-dead, soft-on-crime policies in Minnesota that the Minnesota Democrats have adopted in recent years, especially in relation to Black and Somali crime. I mean, there's countless examples, literally countless examples, but there's been a couple of perfect, I mean, I don't want to say perfect because it's tragic, but it's just like the perfect encapsulation of how they are completely soft on crime when it comes to Blacks and Somalis, but they, let me just give two quick examples of that real quick. This is from December 1st. Convicted sex offender who served no prison time charged in Bloomington rape. I can't even pronounce this dude's name. Abdi Mahat Billy Mohammed, 28, of Minneapolis. So again, this is talk about, I've highlighted this problem before, that a lot of these states, Minnesota, Utah, a lot of these completely captured states, they don't say, Abidimat Billy Mohammed of Somali. They'll say he's a Minneapolis man. Mohammed, 28, kidnapped and raped a woman he met on Snapchat. Mohammed was sentenced. Excuse me, my computer is having an issue real quick. Mohammed was sentenced in May in previous rape cases, but served no prison time. So he was sentenced for two previous rape cases, but served no prison time. And then a separate, so now he was just charged with a third rape. And then another case real quick that I wanted to share of Minneapolis prosecutors just refusing to do anything. Kanili Ibrahim abducted a 12-year-old in Minnesota and raped her. The St. Paul Islamic Center wrote a letter of community support saying he has not assimilated into non-Somali culture. So again, these are Somalians or Islamists, whatever, they're foreigners, openly admitting, well, hey, yes, he raped a 12-year-old girl, but he can't be expected to know that that's wrong. He's not American. He's Somali. He can't be expected to assimilate into our culture of, not raping 12-year-olds because he's Somali. Why are you can't come down hard on him. The community support, we support him because he can't assimilate. They're saying they are saying for us what we have been saying and been called racist for saying. It's just like how the Democrats for like 15 years were bragging about the browning of America. They literally called it the browning of America. How many, how white birth rates have plummeted, and how, all these illegal immigrants are like breeding like rabbits, and the demographics of, the American Southwest, of Texas, of California are completely changing, and it's going to, give Democrats total political power. And then as soon as we start talking about white replacement, they're calling us racist conspiracy theorists, white nationalists. And it's like, no, we are, acknowledging what you have been saying, and it's fine when you say it, but apparently when the victims start speaking out, then, we're the bad ones. So those are just examples of how the Minneapolis Democrats are, completely turning a blind eye or enabling, Black and Somali crime. Meanwhile, in August of this year, I don't know if you guys remember this, I'm sure a lot of you do, Shiloh Hendricks, the mom who was charged, or the mom who was, she was filmed calling a Somalian and a 5-year-old Somalian the N-word. She allegedly caught, this black child who was stealing from her kid's diaper bag. She called him the N-word, and then she doubled down when a Somali man began filming her. She was charged with 3 counts of disorderly conduct, and she is, each of those three charges, they're misdemeanor counts. They each carry a maximum penalty of 90 days in jail. So if you rape Minneapolis, Minnesota women 2 times, if you're charged with rape twice, you get off scot-free. But if you call or if you exercise your First Amendment right, you are charged with disorderly conduct and face, up to 120 days in prison. So, needless to say, Minneapolis, Minnesota, it's completely conquered territory. If you need any more evidence, the Minnesota police chief, either yesterday or a few days ago, just this week, the Minneapolis police chief was urging its citizens to call 911 if they see ICE arresting Somalis. Literally told them, call 911. In the same press conference, the mayor, Jacob Frey, he made an emotional plea to Somalis, telling them how much, they belong and how they're American and how we will, or they will, protect them, and, yada, 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 yada. In Somali, he did half of his press conference was in English, half of it was in a foreign Star Wars language. And in a separate press conference, police, like Somali police officers, because obviously they got Somali police officers there, were speaking directly to Somalis in Somalian about these upcoming ICE raids. And I'm not the first person to make this point, but I did. It was the first thing I thought when I saw this video of this Somali police officer speaking in Somali with the mayor, standing next to him. My first thought was, oh shit. When everybody talks about the government will never come for our guns. The government will never come because American police officers, they know, they respect the Second Amendment. They respect the founding principles of our country. They respect, the American culture, American gun culture. They would never comply with orders to go door to door and round up people's guns, right? I think COVID might have broken that illusion for a lot of us. I think, because there were American police officers that were enforcing, draconian, unconstitutional laws that violated our First Amendment rights, our freedom of association. But literally my first thought when I saw this press conference of foreign, Praetorian guards, foreign, officers of the law speaking a foreign language was, oh, this is how they're going to take our guns if they ever try, at least in Minnesota. They're going to send these Somalian police officers who have no respect for the Second Amendment, who have no respect for the First Amendment, who have no respect for Americans, who see America as land to be conquered, or they see it as a as a global economic zone for them to move to. That is who they're going to send door to door. They're not going to send, white Americans. If any, like all the white Americans left a lot of these police forces when they were forced to get the jab. Frankly, people don't really talk about that a lot. People don't really talk still about the consequences of what happened during COVID, because I think a lot of people want to wipe that from their memory. But a lot of police officers left the police force in these major cities like New York, Minneapolis, Chicago, and the police forces have been dwindling. There's a demographic crisis, so there's not as many, young white Americans to step up, Gen Z Americans to step up in serving the police force, because there's a shortage. And so they're recruiting these foreigners that they've brought in. They're recruiting illegal immigrants. They're recruiting refugees. They're recruiting non-Americans to execute American law, quote unquote American law. What's going to happen when they decide, we're going to pass super strict gun control legislation in Minnesota, and we're going to require police officers to go door to door, and it's going to be these Somalian police officers, officers of the law knocking on your door, telling you to turn your guns away or turn in your guns. Yeah, that's where we're headed, frankly. So Americans are waking up. We're tired of being treated as second-class citizens in our own country. We're tired of the justice system protecting these foreign criminals. We want our country back, which leads to my final story of the evening, and then I'm going to open it up to anybody that wants to share. Again, if you have anything you want to share, just send in a speaking request, and I'm happy to grant that. But just last point I wanted to share is Trump's third world immigration ban. So in the immediate aftermath of the Afghan terror attack that happened on Thanksgiving week, and with the rise of this Somali fraud and the dysfunction in Minnesota and Minneapolis, the Department of Homeland Security, they issued a memo yesterday directing U.S. citizen and immigration services to halt immigration applications from 19 countries. This memo, it builds on Trump's order from June, which was it was a travel ban of these 19 countries. And I had to do a little bit of research and kind of figure out, like, okay, what's the difference between this new memo and the memo back in June? So essentially the June order was a travel ban. So it stopped entry into the United States from those 19 countries, but it still allowed certain people from those countries who are living in the United States. They still got, some of them have still got some asylum applications that are in process. Some of them have refugee status applications, work authorization, all that stuff. They're here already, but they have, they're in the process of getting a green card, whatever it might be. This new memo halts all of that. So immigration benefits for people who are already in the United States, illegally or legally, most of them legal if they're coming from, Somalia or Afghanistan. That's the unfortunate truth. A lot of them they're not flying into, it's not like where you hear these stories of illegal immigrants from China who are coming in, they fly into Mexico and then cross the border. That's, from what I can tell, that's not really happening with, Somalians or Afghans. They were brought here by the State Department, by the Biden administration, by the United Nations. So in June, the order, it affected people outside the U.S., and if you're trying to come in, that was again halted. But if you are already in the U.S. and you're applying for these green card, naturalization, asylum statuses, adjustment statuses, that has been halted, effective immediately as a result of this order. Now, those 19 countries, I'm going to read them off real quick. It is Afghanistan, Burma, Myanmar, whatever you want to call it. It's, got the name change. Chad, Republic of the Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Eritrea, Haiti, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Yemen, Burundi, Cuba, Laos, Sierra Leone, Togo, Turkmenistan, and Venezuela. Now, I'll give, Trump credit where it's due. Thank you. This is certainly a step in the correct direction. We don't want people from these countries coming here, like that obviously. We don't want them coming here. We don't want them becoming citizens. They clearly cannot assimilate. Notably, though, when I saw this, and I think the thing that stands out to me and the thing that's most frustrating is, Trump's been going on this based, tirade. He's been going on this, posturing, and he's been doing all these press conferences and tweeting like, we are going to stop all third world immigration. And he's been doing these press conferences, and he's like, he had one today, like right before actually we started this space. He had one where he's like, I don't like them here. I think he was mostly talking about Somalis, but then he started I think generalizing all third world immigration, where he's just like, I don't like them here. I don't care if that's politically correct. We don't want them. They just complain, yada, yada, yada. Here's the thing. That's the Trump I like. That's the Trump I want. That's goated Trump. That's the Trump that I think most Americans frankly want. Even if they're scared to, talk about it or say it, that's the Trump that they want. Notably though, he's saying we don't want third world immigrants. We're going to stop it, blah, blah, blah. I noticed, my first thing that I noticed when I saw the list that is included in this order is the countries that are not included on the list. So notably, China. China is not, they don't have any immigration halting, which, I mean, you can argue for any of the countries that I'm about to list of which one's the biggest problem. I think China is the ultimate boogeyman, but I think they're a good boogeyman for a right reason. They do IP theft, they do cybersecurity. They're a cybersecurity risk. I don't know if you saw the story of the Chinese researcher who was working for the University of Minnesota, who was arrested for bringing in a pathogen that would essentially wipe out America's food supply. She was just deported. Why not fucking hang her, publicly? That is, I feel like, a very, open and shut case that, you could argue that she should be executed for that. She was just deported. And, Trump announced just a few months ago that there would be 600,000 student visas coming in from China to prop up America's, failing universities, because again, we have a demographic collapse. We have, every the boomers are bigger than the Gen Xers, and the Gen Xers are, they're smaller than the boomers, and the millennials are smaller than the Gen Xers, and the Gen Zers are smaller than the millennials. Every generation is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Well, if you have these, administrations, and you have these administrators for these universities, and you have these massive, welfare programs, you have to, it's not going to work if every generation is smaller. You can't have, unless you just raise tuition to a unsustainable level, which it already is, but unless you, keep raising tuition to or you allow more people into the universities, which is why they're partly, they've gotten rid of the ACT in a lot of these universities. They've dumbed down the acceptance pool. And even then, that's not going to solve this problem to prop up these failing universities. So, that's literally what Trump said. In order to help, keep the vitality of the American university system, they're going to allow 600,000 student visas from China. I did research. Last I checked, they haven't walked that back. Trump hasn't walked that back. So it still seems like the plan is to accept 600,000 student visas from China over the coming years. I think that's a fucking disaster. But yeah, China's not included on the list. Also notable, not on the list, India. They're one of the, prototypical third world country. There's the Indian CDL crisis, which I have a video on that. They have, H-1Bs, almost all of them come from India. And, that's essentially legalized wage undermining of Americans. Pakistan is not included on that list, the country that was harboring bin Laden, and they're basically India's twin brother. Most of the Middle East is actually not included on the list. There's some token Middle Eastern countries like Iran, but I don't think, Iraq was not included on that list. Saudi Arabia was not included on that list. Most of the Middle East is not on that list. Most of Africa is not on that list. There's some token African countries that are included, Chad, the Congo, but Libya is on the list, but Egypt's not on the list. A lot of these, third world countries in Africa, they are, according to Trump, that's still okay. Mexico is still on the list. Mexico is not on the list, and most of Central and South America, not on the list. I mean, we had just a few days ago in Provo, we had that massive cockfighting ring. We had the Mexican DUI that killed those 2 Americans. We have, a third of West Valley crashes involving, unlicensed Central South American Mexican drivers causing these crashes. You can look that up on Deseret News. So, and let me actually, Trump, I want to actually read Trump's truth. He posted this on Thanksgiving. I'm not going to read the whole thing because they're really long, and he had a lot of, this isn't the one, this isn't taken from the Tim Walz one, but he said, I will permanently, even as we have progressed technologically, immigration policy has eroded those gains and living conditions for many. I will permanently pause migration from all third world countries to allow the U.S. system to fully recover, terminate all of the millions of Biden's illegal admissions, including those signed by Sleepy Joe Biden's autopen, and remove anyone who is not a net asset to the United States or incapable of loving our country, and end all federal benefits and subsidies to non-citizens in our country, denaturalize migrants who undermine domestic tranquility, and deport any foreign national who is a public charge, security risk, or non-compatible with Western civilization. That last part, non-compatible with Western civilization, I mean, I'm sorry. You got to have India on that list. You got to have China on that list. You got to have all of Africa on that list, except for the Afrikaners. And you got to have most of the Middle East, if not all of the Middle East, on that list. So I'm happy that we're banning, immigrants and green cards from, Afghanistan and Burundi and Eritrea, but it's not enough. If we're going to take our country back, we need to ban all third world migration. So, Mr. President, we agree with your list, but it needs to be much bigger. You can't just stop at these 19 countries. We need all third world immigration halted. So anyways, those are just my thoughts. There's a lot of other stories I wanted to cover, but I just really wanted to do a deep dive into all those topics. So I'm going to end the recording right now, and I'm going to post this recording on YouTube and Rumble.